Before I start, I would like to say that the upcoming series was inspired by YouTuber Colin Looks Back and his Disney animated villains retrospective videos, and that this series is in no way meant to copy him. As I said at the start of my animated history Blue Sky ranking video, the Supreme Court rules that a parody-based claim is fair use under Section 107 of the Copyright Act. Plus, there's no rule that says a YouTuber can make his own analysis series based on another YouTuber's channel. Also, just a heads up, I have not watched every one of the animated shows of the company that I will be mentioning soon. I may have to look at bits and pieces of the villains or listen to the thoughts of other reviewers. Thank you, and with all that out of the way, let the show begin. Dreamworks Animation is one of the top dogs of animated films, next to Disney of course. In fact, the competitive rivalry between these companies is more or less legendary because both are the most long-term animated film or animated anything companies known to exist, and most of the films they put out over the years are often neck and neck with each other in terms of quality, financial potential, and often at times having a similar story structure. Moving past the rivalry between these studios, I would like to bring up that one thing Dreamworks has in common with Disney in terms of being a studio that has been around for a very long time is the villains. Yep, as you might have guessed from the title, this series is all about going into a retrospective for the villains made by the company. Some of these baddies have gone down in history as the best animated villains around. This series is meant to go into a retrospective of each of these villains, both in movie and TV series form, with me discussing their conception, development, how they are played into the story, and what I think of them. I will also be talking about villains from video game adaptations of either the movie or TV show. Also, to get this out of the way first, I am only going to be talking about media that Dreamworks had a direct production on rather than them distributing said media. Before I talk about the start of the Dreamworks villains, let's get into the origins of Dreamworks itself. The company was founded by a man named Carl Rosendahl, who first named the company Dreamworks Pacific Data Images. The team of animators he hired would at first only do animation for commercials and film logos. Their first attempt at animation was in the second Terminator film, where they did the special effects on the robots. In autumn of 1994, former Disney veteran, Jeffrey Katzenberg, resigned from Disney on account of, to put it politely, creative differences. He, alongside music composer, David Geffen, and famed filmmaker, Steven Spielberg, banded together to create their own animation company called Dreamworks, SKG. I guess sometimes taking stuff from your name and putting into a project you're making is the easiest way to label it. Somehow, they convinced Rosendahl to merge his company with theirs, with Pacific Data Images providing the animation needed to make their projects. And thus, Dreamworks Animation was born. Before they made any films though, the company first began their pursuit to fame on the small screen of television. I will be talking about two of the animated shows in this video. The first show that Dreamworks created was called Toonsylvania, written by Bill Kopp and Jeff DeGrandis and produced by Steven Spielberg himself, which is a typical Saturday morning cartoon comedy that featured episodes split into at least 5 segments. The first one, labeled Frankenstein, features 3 iconic characters of the Mary Shelley's Frankenstein story: Dr. Frankenstein, his assistant Igor, and Frankenstein's monster, who is given the name Phil, getting into all kinds of wacky hijinks. The second would be a small in-between segment featuring Igor and Phil trying to watch TV with Igor failing to use the remote. The third would either be Night of the Living Fred, which is about a family of zombies called the Deadmans going about their, well, undead lives, or Attack of the Killer Bee Movies, which is about a group of soldiers, scientists, and a handsome guy named Ace Deuce, facing off against some kind of monster you would find in a cheap horror movie. The fourth segment, like the second, is a short in-between and just features Igor trying to teach some kind of science lesson, which would backfire constantly. And the final segment features Igor reading Phil a story about a bratty, loudmouth girl named Melissa Screech, with nearly every story having a different, sometimes fairy tale theme surrounding her. In the second season, the release of the segments were constantly being rearranged, most likely because producer Paul Rugg took over as the leading writer after Kopp and DeGrandis decided to quit the show. Toonsylvania aired on Fox Kids for 11 months from February of 1998 to January of 1999 with 2 seasons, 21 episodes and 82 segments. Usually on a block dubbed the No Yell Motel, which featured other horror-themed kids shows like Goosebumps and Erie, Indiana. The show was made by a television branch the people of Dreamworks made called Dreamworks Animation Television that ironically went under in 1999 due to a consolidation move. The company managed to resurface many years later, but that's a story for another time. Before I continue, I feel like I should give a brief mention to the executives of this company in the late 90s, Gary Crizzle and David Simon, who were once executives for Walt Disney Television Animation. I guess even on TV, Dreamworks and Disney are both competitors with employees who defect. Anyway, getting back to Toonsylvania, going by the nature of the show, it is a comedy show with the not-so-horrific monster characters I just mentioned constantly getting into wacky hijinks that wouldn't be out of place in, say, a Looney Tunes cartoon. Going into my thoughts about the show for a minute, I will honestly tell you guys that I have never heard or even watched the show when I was a kid since I was more partial to Cartoon Network, Nickelodeon, or maybe even a Disney cartoon, so don't expect me to be some kind of whiz when it comes to forgotten cartoons like this. When I saw bits and pieces of it months ago after I got the idea to create this web show, I just saw it as a typical zany comedy cartoon. Also, just to get this out of the way, since I more or less believe people will ask about it, I will not be including villain protagonists in my retrospectives. This will include Megamind and the bad guys when I reach them. The buck with this principle begins with the 3 Frankenstein characters since while they aren't the nicest people around, they are nevertheless seen as primary characters. In case you haven't seen the show, I should tell you that apart from the one-off monsters in the B-movie segments, there's hardly a consistent threat that appears in the show due to every segment being more focused on comedy or facing some non-villain threat. The conflicts in the Frankenstein segments are all about the 3 characters being at each other's throats, and the conflicts in the Night of the Living Fred segments are all about a zombie family struggling to fit in a society that are put off by the fact that they're, well, zombies. With one episode even featuring the Deadmans having to fight for their civil rights when the principal of the children's school expels Fred due to being dead, and it falls on Fred's sister, Ashley, to help her brother out. Although, I am going to count only one character in the show as a villain, or at best, an antagonist.
Let's go, everybody! It's time for my show!
Melissa Screech is, to me at least, the closest thing to a straightforward antagonist in the show, because she, while nowhere near the likes of, say, Darth Vader from Star Wars, manages to show that she can be quite the little ball of chaos, relatively speaking, since her actions don't impact any character within on the show because, to reiterate, she's a character that's in a story within a story that Igor reads to fill. Though in the second season, the showrunners seem to have dropped this gimmick in favor of having the little loudmouth being in her own world. I could not find any concept art or trivia regarding the conception of Melissa. Since Dreamworks would most likely prefer to sweep the show under the rug, it probably makes sense. Melissa is voiced by Nancy Cartwright, who during this time of her voice acting career, was well known for a more famous ball of chaos, Bart Simpson of The Simpsons, but voices Melissa in a voice she uses for another Simpsons character, the local bully Nelson Muntz. Going into some of the segments that featured Melissa at her most outrageously bratty, one was a parody of The Little Mermaid where she met and fell for a human prince. But when the prince rejects her due to having a loud voice, she asked a sea witch to make her trademark screeching be like a siren call. Ultimately though, this works against Melissa because the prince has become her stalker. You probably shouldn't think about how creepier this could get since the prince is an adult and Melissa is still a child. Another segment, parodying Little Red Riding Hood, had Melissa deliberately torture the wolf who pretends to be her grandmother. Heck, said grandmother actively left the coop to avoid Melissa and paid off the wolf to pretend to be her. It would appear that Melissa's loud personality tend to alienate her from anyone who knows her personally, and while Melissa's actions in this segment are not villainous per se, it doesn't really paint her in the best light. Looking into Melissa's home life for a second, it would seem that not even her parents are safe from her obnoxious tendencies, But they do nothing to teach her to behave correctly, they don't show her discipline or scold her, and whenever they actually do try to be at least a little strict with Melissa, they would fail miserably because as a textbook spoiled brat, Melissa does not give any attention to them trying to teach her. Going back to the Red Riding Hood segment, the wolf eventually tries to revolt and decapitate Melissa by biting her head off, which if you have seen a cartoon that features an annoying small animal tormenting a larger animal that could kill them, works well as you would expect. Another segment that parodied Goldilocks and the Three Bears had Melissa shown being tied to a tree and freed by the Three Bears. She repays their kindness by acting like the worst house guest in history, which culminated in a battle between the bears and Melissa, who soon ends up getting them captured by hunters. They escape captivity by digging a hole and making their way back home, where they capture Melissa and tie her to another tree, where she is soon freed by the three little pigs. And thus, the cycle of abusing others' kindness continues. The final episode that I will be talking about showed Melissa at her most villainous. After celebrating her birthday, Melissa decided to kidnap holiday icons who give gifts to children all around the world just to have an attack helicopter, mostly because her mother and the birthday fairy told her that girls her age shouldn't have such things. The ending implies that she simply made the story up to the viewing audience before a police raid implies otherwise. Before I move on, I should probably say that in terms of memorable bratty little girls that came out around the same time as Toonsylvania, Melissa, like the show itself, pretty much went under the radar, which is saying a lot since the show only lasted for 11 months, so whenever someone makes a top 10 list of bratty cartoon girls, don't expect to see Melissa Screech on at least a majority of them. Despite the show being fairly obscure, there were toys of the characters, each made by two different brands. There was figures made by the company Toy Island, and Melissa happens to be part of the collection, and there were kids' meal toys released by Burger King with the Melissa figure in tantrum mode. You wouldn't think that a show like Toonsylvania would get a video game adaptation, but it did. Made by the company, RFX Interactive, and released by Light and Shadow Production and Ubisoft for Game Boy Color in the year 2000, the game is about Igor accidentally blowing up Phil after trying to test some apparel on him and having to travel through different worlds to collect the pieces and put Phil back together before Dr. Frankenstein finds out. Since I never heard of the show back then, I also never heard of this game, as I mostly played either an old-style Mario or Sonic during that time period. Getting back to the matter at hand, a video game is supposed to have bosses that appear at the end of levels, and this one certainly does. The bosses you fight each have a part of Phil, and, as per video game logic, you must defeat them in order to claim the pieces. Going by the bosses one by one, the first is a living statue in the garden level, who has Phil's feet, a greenish blob monster with red and yellow eyes in the moat level, who has Phil's right arm, a vampire in the cemetery level, who has Phil's left arm, a blue gargoyle in the roof level, who has Phil's torso, and finally, the devil himself in the underworld level, who has Phil's head. If I'm being totally honest, these boss fights are not all that impressive. Well, the first three aren't anyway. All you have to do is make Igor punch the bosses a few times and then you win the fight. The gargoyle and the devil put up the most challenge for you though. For the gargoyle, it can fly, so you might have to jump while also using a helipad bonus to reach an extra height and hit the gargoyle with your skull-throwing ability. As for the devil, he manages to set some stages for you to overcome before attacking him directly. First, he sends some moving flames on the ground, then he sends some white demons for you to fight. Overcome those two obstacles, then you can fight him. Repeat all of those stages a few times, and at the end of the boss fight, it turns out that the devil is just a bunch of smaller demons stacked up together. Guess even people in Dante's Inferno aren't above the typical human totem pole gag. You also have to fight a bunch of henchmen that block your way from advancing the levels, typical for Game Boy cassettes like this one. One thing that I will give the creators of this game credit for is how creepy the underworld level is. It really gives you a sense of dread, especially since this was a game made for kids. One of the best examples of this is when Igor is forced to run away from a group of demons while also having to jump on platforms and avoiding falling into the lava. I'd like to end this segment off here by reiterating that, like the show itself, the game has very much fallen into obscurity. I mean, I said a few times that I never heard of either the show it was based on, and I bet a majority of viewers haven't either. And with that, like Dreamworks itself, I will be leaving both Melissa and Toonsylvania and moving on to the second show the company produced before turning to movies, Invasion America, which was produced by again Steven Spielberg alongside Harve Bennett. Unlike with Toonsylvania, Invasion America leans a lot more to the serious side of animated television shows. To anyone who hasn't heard of Invasion America, the show is about extraterrestrial beings called the Tyrusian who plan on invading Earth to drain its resources on the orders from a villainous Tyrusian called the Dragit, since their home planet Tyrus is slowly dying and some of the Tyrusian people loyal to him have infiltrated the US Army to use their resources to help his scheme. The Dragit's nephew and ruler of Tyrus, Kalusha, is appalled by the decision and tries to stop him, which leads to the Dragit rallying the Tyrus forces against Kale, with the exception of his friend Rafe, both of whom escape to Earth disguised as humans, where Kale meets, falls for and weds a woman named Rita Carter, and they bore a son named David. Soon though, Kale decides to finish what he started when he and his family are found by the Dragit and his army, and is forced to leave his family behind and go back to Tyrus to find a Tyrusian group still loyal to him dubbed Ushadi in order to stop the Dragit once and for all. 17 years later, a teenage David soon learns the truth about his father and is forced to deal with the Dragit and his army and stop their invasion plans. Despite being more interesting in concept, Invasion America had even less of a running time than Toonsylvania, as it was on air for one whole month, from June 8 to July 7, 1998. Though to be fair, it was advertised as a mini-series. Also, to anyone who has ever bothered to watch the series would know that it has an animated art style similar to cartoons like Batman the Animated Series and Gargoyles, alongside being written like it was made for those shows in general. This was because one of the writers of Invasion America, Michael Reeves, who died 2 years ago from Parkinson's disease at the age of 72, was a writer for those two shows. The biggest reason I can think that it got a short run was because back in the late 90s, Warner Brothers aired it as a primetime show, which means that it would air in the night. This was because the heads of Warner's believed that the cartoon was too violent, and even an attempt at trimming that down and airing on the kids' network didn't work out. It's a shame too, because this series had all the potential to be a good science fiction action cartoon, and I will say that there are some more or less impressive feats of early CGI seen in the show. Guess Dreamworks was preparing themselves for a CGI future. But let's move on from that grand disappointment and talk about the Dragit himself.
Kalusha, what a pity. All this work for nothing.
Like with Melissa Screech, I could not find any concept art regarding this guy and by extension, the forthcoming antagonists in the show that I will be talking about outside of him. I guess like with Toonsylvania, Dreamworks wants to keep their involvement on this show under wraps. I should tell you guys that since I never heard of the show before but have found it online on YouTube with all the episodes munched together in 2 separate videos, I've binged nearly the entirety of Invasion America just to see what I can take from the villains of the show. The Dragit is voiced by the late veteran actor, Tony Jay, who is well known for voicing a plethora of villains, most notably Judge Claude Frollo in Disney's The Hunchback of Notre Dame. I feel like Dreamworks went all in for a character like this, because even by late 90s standards, an evil alien overlord wanting to dominate Earth archetype was starting to get worn down. Heck, even the obscure Final Don Bluth film, Titan AE, had an alien overlord villain that has an original texture in the Dredge Queen. Where does the Dragit fall into this? Well, unless you haven't been listening a few minutes ago, the Tyrusian planet is slowly dying and the Dragit and his species will be doomed to extinction. However, again, to anyone who was listening or even watched the show yourself, Kalusha has produced an offspring in David, who is half human, therefore showing that the Dragit's want for his species to live on could have been done more humanely. I guess it's possible that typical prejudice against humans or seeing the impurity of such an alternative is what keeps the Dragit from reconsidering his scheme. Anyway, circling back to what I said about Jay's role as Frollo, I can actually see a lot of similarities between Frollo and the Dragit. They are both individuals who have been twisted by their own sense of right and wrong, which drives their cruel actions. Though, the Dragit does earn our sympathy a little more because at least he does show some semblance of care for his fellow Tyrusian people, while Frollo just wants to act on his personal motives and even has the gall to admit to himself and to others that everything he does is within the laws of God Almighty himself. That being said, the Dragit's other main goal, beyond saving his people, is actually personal, and that is to tempt David to join their cause and abandon all of his father's moral standings. Part of me wants to believe that, deep down, the Dragit does have some care for his great-nephew, and he also sees David as a reflection of Kalusha, who he most likely still holds in some regard. Though, once David makes it abundantly clear that joining the Dragit and invading the Earth and sucking its resources dry is not something he's interested in, the Dragit decides that he needs to die so that he will no longer interfere with his plans. Taking a look at the Dragit's villain prowess, I'd say that he doesn't do too bad of a job putting the pieces in place for his invasion, like setting up a base of operations on the Earth's moon and has a squad of loyal followers who have infiltrated the United States government. He plots on using said base to fire asteroids aimed at famous American landmarks, with Washington, D.C., the highest form of American government, being his main target. The Dragit, for the most part, barely has any one-on-one with David when the latter sets out to stop his evil scheme. The closest interaction that I can think of is actually a hallucination in one episode where David is put into this fabricated reality caused by a pair of Tyrusian human hybrid twins, more on them later, where after David is brought to the Tyrusian planet, the Dragit of that reality, alongside David's own parents, attempt to persuade David to join his cause. This worked as well as you would imagine for someone as morally upright as David. Outside of that, the Dragit mostly just works from behind the scenes and mostly appears whenever an update on either his scheme or David's whereabouts are brought up. Despite that, the final episode showed that he seems to be willing to throw himself into the ring if he felt that he had to take action personally, as he was planning on dealing with David by going to the moon base to stop him and his team from foiling his plans. Unfortunately, this does not happen and the base is destroyed when the firing mechanism was switched in reverse by Doc, a Tyrusian who is against the Dragit. Since the show did not get renewed for a second season, that means that the Dragit managed to come out of this battle alive since he was not on the base when it blew up. He could still be out there, planning his revenge. But since the last we see of the Dragit is when he orders the meteorite strike that ends up backfiring, we best just move on to the other villains within the series. I personally believe that every villain needs some kind of minion, or minions if there is to be more than one, to help carry out their dirty work. These minions can range from different varieties. Like some minions are sympathetic and kind people who are merely misguided and ultimately decide to betray the villain in the end, some minions are fully willing to serve their boss, morality be darned, and stick by them thin and thick, or the minion is planning on usurping their master and plan on outdoing them in terms of being the bad guy. Heck, even the villain's relationship with their minions tend to vary. The villain will either treat their underlings dismissively at best or abusively at worst. Though in some cases, the villain is very trusting and affectionate towards their minion, which itself could be for a number of reasons, whether the henchman is a family member or if they're actually good at doing the dirty work they've been assigned to do. The most common portrayal of a villain and henchman dynamic is that the villain typically shows no care for the minion and only want to see their evil plan succeed. Invasion America has at least some of these types of minions. We'll start with the one who has the least amount of screen time within the show. General Conrad is a Tyrusian who has taken the form of a human and has seemed to work his way into the Air Force military ranks of America. The best way to describe him is that he is an evil version of Spock from Star Trek. Why do I say that? Well, for one thing, he's actually voiced by the guy who played Spock, the legendary Leonard Nimoy. This might have been intentional because Harve Bennett worked on the first 4 Star Trek films and he might have wanted to add in a Star Trek Easter egg when making this show, and what better way of doing that than giving Spock a role? Anyway, before I talk about Conrad's actions seen in the show, I'd like to talk about a personal thought regarding him, and that is his name. To me, I feel that his name may stem from the Russian term, comrade, which in general means a fellow soldier or personal you are in league with. Given the fact that the bad guys in this show are planning on taking down the US, I'd say that Conrad's name has some kind of meaning since he's helping the Dragit in the aforementioned scheme. Finally getting into Conrad's role in the show, well, I don't think there is a lot to say about him. Like the Dragit himself, Conrad merely operates from behind the scenes and is only contacted on updates regarding the location of David, only instead of in outer space, he's in an underground desert base called the Charles Air Force Base, seen in the first few episodes of the show. Yes, considering that the base was used to make weapons to help the aliens conquer Earth, someone does need to look after the place, and the Dragit does give him the assignment to find David, but you'd think that any of the upcoming villains would have filled that role. Circling back to what I said about Conrad not having a lot of information to be said about him, that's because he only appeared throughout the first quarter of the show, with his final physical appearance in the episode Assault giving him more of a fleshed-out personality. In said episode, once David became aware of the desert base and infiltrates it alongside Rafe and a majority of the Ushadi to have it destroyed, Conrad goes all out trying to stop them. From what we see of Conrad in this episode, I think I can declare that he proves to be more evil than the Dragit. What do I mean? Well, in one scene, after some of the Tyrusian soldiers under his authority have cornered Rafe in the core reactor room, he orders a subordinate to seal it off and to release some creatures called Manglers, who I will be talking about soon, to deal with Rafe, and when the subordinate says no, not wanting to risk the lives of the soldiers, Conrad shoots him dead for his disobedience and orders another flunky to do the job. This shows that Conrad does not hold the people under his watch in high regard, seeing all of them as expendable and has no tolerance for insubordination. As a corrupt military authority figure, that's actually pretty fitting, all things considered. Since the Dragit's ultimate goal was to help his people, Conrad really separated himself from his boss in terms of how he views his fellow Tyrusian people. Now yes, the Dragit was willing to kill his own people as well, but from what I've seen, that's only if they have proven themselves to be traitors to him and his cause. Since the soldiers at the base were loyal to the Dragit as much as they were to Conrad, I'm afraid that makes Conrad the greater of two evils. If you don't agree with me, I get it, but let's move on along to the episode's end, where Conrad soon confronts David and Rafe outside the now destroyed base and tries to kill them with a gun, but David uses his Tyrusian abilities to turn the attack back on Conrad, injuring his right arm. As a last-ditch effort, Conrad tries to kill David with the Tyrusian ship he used to escape the base before it blew up, but David once again used his Tyrusian powers to throw a single boulder on the ship, which threw Conrad off his rhythm and caused him to crash into a mountain. Looking at this scene for a minute, I think we should acknowledge the rather scared look on Conrad's face as he is about to face his death. He looks positively frightened, possibly the most frightened that a villain from this show has been. It's natural for a villain to be afraid to die, which is the basis for many villains' schemes, this one included, and in a sense, I probably would have been just as scared as Conrad here. He was probably so scared that he didn't think to quickly eject himself out of the ship when it was about to crash with him in it. Though, this is another point I want to bring up, that I think that Conrad's defeat was too easy because all David did to stop him was throw a boulder at the ship. He later appears in two hallucinations that David has, the first being a mirage in the desert following the destruction of the underground base where he tries to kill David with a gun, and the second in the aforementioned fake reality in David's mind as a horrifying-looking zombie seemingly wanting revenge on David. That is the last we see of him in the show, so let's move on. The Dragit seems to be partial to having henchmen that are human-disguised Tyrusian who acquired a military position, as we see with General Gordon, voiced by James Sicking, who sadly died at the age of 90 just last year. Sicking has another military role as Lieutenant Howard Hunter in the police show, Hill Street Blue. You might think that Gordon is just a carbon copy of Conrad, only that he stood around longer. That's what I believed at first, but after giving it some thought, I realized that Gordon has some things that distinguish himself from Conrad. While Conrad mainly operated behind the scenes, Gordon is a lot more active and involved in trying to capture David. I imagine that the Dragit employed him to do such, as he might need someone to do field work, and throughout the show, Gordon shows that he has direct ties to the US President himself, named McAllister in the show, basically acting as an inside man not unlike Conrad, but is more active in the field, which proves to be beneficial to the Dragit. Gordon was once a colonel before Conrad's death gave him the opportunity to rise in the ranks. Despite being after David, Gordon also seems to be at odds with the two government agents who soon befriend David, Major Phil Stark and his assistant Angie Romar, after he ends up taking over their missions, even feigning concern for their well-being at one point. It's soon revealed later on in the show that Gordon was the mastermind behind the attack on Maple Island during the beginning of the show, seeking to capture both David and Rafe. He is also shown to be the one to force the Lair twins to find and capture David while threatening to end a partnership with their scientist mother. Gordon is also smart enough to employ a shape-shifting alien to be his main enforcer and to blend into human society and to also masquerade as President McAllister once his cover is nearly blown. Again, I'll be talking about that minion in a while. Since Gordon has direct contact with the US president, he can also make it so where the Tyrosean conspiracy is covered up to keep the government from preparing itself against his brethren, shown in a few instances where he tries to keep the president from finding out the truth. I will say that Gordon seems to be the more competent of the generals based on the fact that he has many resources to try and make sure the Dragit's plan does not fail. Out of all of the Dragit's henchmen, this guy seems to be carrying most of the weight in terms of making sure that the invasion goes well while snuffing out anyone who could interfere with it. Of course, even the most competent of henchmen can end up failing, most likely because they are too focused on following orders. Gordon meets his end when he tries to use a stealth fighter jet to stop a space shuttle the heroes have hijacked to go to the moon to destroy the base on there, but the atmosphere of outer space ends up doing the fighter in as it plummets back to Earth with Gordon inside. I guess like Icarus, Gordon flew too close to the sun, which in this case is outer space. There have been plenty of cases where a henchman has their fates handed to them by blindly following their superior's orders, disregarding their own safety just to avoid disobeying instructions. It's worth noting that we never actually see the fighter jet crash anywhere on Earth, which may have been because the creators were hoping a second season would get made and decided to leave it up in the air if Gordon survived. Since the show did not get picked up for another season, we may never know. In a show about aliens, you'd expect that there'd be a wide variety of them. Different species with countless designs and stuff like that. Well, maybe that was the plan for Invasion America before Dreamworks decided to shelf the show. We mostly see the Tyrosean race as the main species of alien. That did not stop us from getting at least one or two other species. One of these creatures is called a Metamorph, hailing from the planet Kaon. As promised from a minute ago, I am now speaking about the shapeshifter minion that answers to Gordon, Major Lomac. Voiced by veteran voice actor Jim Cummings, Lomac proves to be as competent to Gordon as much as Gordon is to the Dragit. He uses his shapeshifting skills to pull off effective human disguises and sticks by Gordon's side as a major in the latter's military branch. For most of the show, Lomac is kept to the sidelines and remains in his human disguise. It isn't until sometime in the back half of the show in the episode Allies where Lomac reveals his true form to kill Dr. Lair after her children fail to keep David contained after capturing him. I'll talk more about that when I get to the twins. Later, he attacks David and Romar after turning into his metamorph form when he sees them disguised as soldiers while walking through a tunnel. This form is sort of like if the typical bug-eyed aliens had the body build of the xenomorph in Alien. I will also say that this form is truly frightening as during his fight with Romar, Lomac gets some very scary close-ups. We also see that regular firearms have no effect on Lomac when he is in this form, a fact that Gordon must have figured out and another reason why he hired Lomac. Fortunately, David uses his abilities to bust open an exhaust pipe, causing hot steam to flow everywhere in the tunnel and distracts Lomac and giving David and Romar an opportunity to escape. The form is seen again in the following episode, Charade, where as I mentioned before, Lomac takes the form of President McAllister to lure the good guys into a trap. Despite Lomac having the element of surprise on his side, David uses his powers to make Lomac float in the air to stop his attack. After the good guys get away, there is a small sequence of Gordon offering comfort to a defeated Lomac. This is another example that differentiates Gordon from Conrad. As I said before, Conrad was alright with sacrificing those loyal to him to get rid of David. Here though, Gordon does show some legit concern for his underling, even telling him that he should rest. Though him adding in that he needs Lomac to be fully restored might have you thinking that he only sees Lomac as a means to an end like how Conrad did to his men. While I can see that, I do think that it is nice to see that Gordon, in his own manner, showing genuine care for the ones helping him. Lomac's last most notable role is seen trying to hunt down David and his friends by using one of the Lair twins, Simon, while flying a helicopter, only to be told by Gordon to dispose of Simon after informing Lomac that they are heading the wrong way because of circumstances that I'll get into a little later. This was Lomac's last appearance overall, as he does not appear after Gordon's plane crashes down to Earth or when the moon base gets blown up. I guess they were really building up to another season that again, never came to be. Since the end of the Lomac part involved at least one of the twins, this might be a very good time to talk about the next villains on the list. Simon and Sonia Lair are, as I mentioned before, mutations made from genetic material from Tyrusian and humans that were made by a scientist with the same surname and were part of a plan to make a whole army of Tyrusian human hybrids to take over Earth, but for some reason, they were the only two who were successfully made. Both of them also have their own personalities. Simon is the more impulsive and aggressive twin, often resorting to violence at the drop of a hat, while Sonia is the more smarter and practical twin, often trying to keep a cool head and assessing whatever situation they're in. Simon is voiced by Tom Adcox Hernandez, who, in the aforementioned Gargoyles show, voiced the comic relief Lexington, and Sonia is voiced by voice actress Kath Soucie, also voiced Rita Carter whenever she appeared in the show. Out of all of the antagonists in this short-lived cartoon, they make the most appearances, more so than the Dragit himself. As underlings for the Dragit, they seem to be the most competent at combat as much as Gordon is competent at manipulation. Unlike Conrad and Gordon, they do not have any sort of contact with the Dragit and mostly interact with either Conrad or Gordon when they are put into action. They first appear in the second episode The Sun, where they attempt to capture David on orders from Conrad, who was apparently in the know about the genetic clone army project. They find David and his friend Jim at a museum at Maple Island and lure him into a trap, with Sonia being a femme fatale of sorts and Simon getting the drop on David once he's alone. Thankfully, David and Jim get out with their lives still intact, with David escaping with Rafe when he shows up in his cop car, but the twins soon get a photo of Rafe while in his sheriff disguise and send it to Conrad while also giving him David's location. Soon enough, when General Gordon takes up the mantle as the second-in-command for the Dragit following Conrad's death, Simon and Sonia were once again tasked to track down David, this time by Gordon. This is where we learn of their status as the only working hybrids of the potential army project that ultimately never came to be. The twins do manage to track him down when he returns to Maple Island, this time at the local mall. Simon mostly does the fighting in this confrontation, and Sonia only appears to help her brother up when David uses his newfound powers to make a chandelier fall on Simon when he has David at his mercy, but they end up prevailing and take David away after Simon threatens Jim with bodily harm if David does not give himself up. Let the record show that Simon would harm Jim regardless, but Sonia arrives and holds her brother at gunpoint to make him drop Jim. After which, she makes David get in their car just as Stark and Romar arrive. Throughout this video, I've mentioned how David is put in a false reality where the Dragit tries to reach out to and offer David a chance to join his cause. Well, that brings us to the episode The Trip, where, as I said before, it turns out that the Lair twins were responsible for that, as they strapped David to some kind of brainwashing device that would enable the Dragit to telepathically contact David. After that plan fails, Simon decides to try and use David's glove that he's been using to harness his Tyrusian abilities against him, but the glove ends up crushing Simon's hand. This was actually foreshadowed a few episodes back in Flight when Rafe gave David the glove and states that it was meant to work only for David since he has Kale's genetic makeup, and says that otherwise, his hand would have gotten hurt. After David saves Simon and takes back the glove, a grateful Sonia realizes that she may be on the wrong team and decides to set David free. Of course, while Sonia begins to grow a conscience, Simon is still as violent and cruel as ever. I can't help but wonder why Sonia would put up with Simon's bad behavior other than them being siblings. It's probably because next to their mother, Simon is the only person she has in her life and is probably so used to his bad attitude that she has developed some kind of emotional invulnerability to it. Not that it makes their relationship any less toxic. Getting back to the story, After Lomac kills her mother and is also ordered to kill the twins, Sonya officially decides to get out of Dodge and switch sides while literally dragging her brother to join her since he was tranquilized earlier by their mother. She returns to Maple Island to visit Jim to get David's whereabouts, by holding him at gunpoint. Well, she is still new to being good, so bad habits like this are things she's still trying to wean off. It is here where we are introduced to one power the twins share with one another, a mind link that enables them to sense each other telepathically as Simon abandons Sonya. After that, she gets better at redeeming herself, as when she reunites with David, she admits that she doesn't expect him or his friends to welcome her with open arms given that she's been trying to make David join the Dragit alongside a bunch of other unethical stuff. Simon, meanwhile, goes back to General Gordon and offers to bring him to David due to the mind link he has with his sister in exchange for letting him live. To make a long story short, Sonya finds out that her brother is using the mind link to lure the bad guys to David and decides to lure them away by driving away from the rocket the good guys used to go to the moon and destroy the Dragit's attack base. This is what I was referring to when I was at the end of my talk of Lomac. And to reiterate, Simon gets thrown off the chopper and lands on the ground. When Sonya comes to him, he, for the first time ever, begs for help. Sonya angrily reminds Simon that he flaked on her, but some pride still lingers in Simon as he tells her that they're only in this mess because she helped David go free. Despite this, Sonya relents and offers her hand, which Simon takes, thus hinting that redemption isn't too far off for Simon. This is also the last we ever see of them since, you know what? I have repeatedly stated that the show had its plug pulled too soon, so I will stop repeating it as I cover the rest of the villains. Though had the show continued, I can't help but think about how Simon's redemption could have carried over. Would he have joined David in ultimately stopping the Dragit? Would he find a way to fit into human society? Would he lose his violent tendencies? To quote the Tootsie Pop commercial narrator, the world may never know. Also, just in case someone brings it up, I should at least mention that the twins show that they have Tyrusian powers from their spliced genes and they are seen using them whenever in combat, Simon mostly. Beyond that, Sonya also used her powers to confirm David's status as a Tyrusian. And that's all about it really. I do have one complaint about the twins though, and that would be Sonya's sudden turnaround because it just feels like it's there for plot convenience and isn't developed strongly. Just saying. We now reach the point where I get to the minor villains in the media I am covering. The first is the twins' mother, Dr. Hazel Lair, voiced by Jennifer Darling. We don't learn much about her, only that she supervises the hybrid army project that ultimately left a lot to be desired. It's heavily implied that she's the human whose DNA was used to create Simon and Sonya to begin with, given that they share her surname and refer to her as their mother. But since the show does not give us any clear answer on this matter, it's left to our imagination if either what I said was true or other humans' genetic materials were used and she simply adopted the twins. Heck, for all we know, she could be a Tyrusian as well who used her DNA on the project and the human genetics came from unwitting test subjects. That's pretty dark when you think about it. From what we see of Dr. Lair, she seems very passionate about the hybrid project, despite barely making any success on it. Her passion for the project seems to be the thing that has overshadowed her own morality, at least in some respects. What do I mean? Well, she is rather frightened when Gordon threatens to put the whole matter on ice if the twins don't track down David. They manage to catch David, but as you already know, Sonya frees him. After Dr. Lair learns of this, she, in a rather cruel move, sells Sonya out when she contacts Gordon about David's release, hoping to still be in his good graces. Unfortunately, karma rears its ugly head, when Gordon nevertheless acts as the hybrid plan and as Lomac killed Dr. Lair in cold blood. If I were to find any redeeming qualities for Dr. Lair, it would be that she does seem to have at least a semblance of care for her children, as she sedated Simon when he has an angry fit over his hand being squashed and when she sadly looks at Sonya through the one-way mirror in the hybrid lab shortly before Lomac kills her, possibly hinting a remorse for scapegoating her earlier. While I can't defend Dr. Lair's many moral breaches like messing with genetic splicing and throwing her daughter under the bus for the sake of protecting the aforementioned splicing, we do also see at least some humanity in her. That, and her death sparks Sonya's redemption since she now has no one but a brother who treats her like dirt and resolves to betray the Dragit and everyone else loyal to him. Talk about a minor character having a big impact on the story. The Tyrusian people seem to have feral animals that they treat as pets on their planet called manglers. Like Lomac, they also seem to draw inspiration from the xenomorph from Alien, only smaller and more animal-like. I know it seems like I am saying that a living creature trying to survive is a villain, but hear me out. One mangler named Blue, owned by Doc, is shown to be very loyal and almost sentient-like, which stands to reason that all of the other manglers would have the same mindset. Their voice actors are not credited, but if I had to guess, their noises were likely supplied by voice actor Frank Welker since he mostly does animal noises. The only manglers that have some kind of importance outside of Blue is a gang of feral ones that were released in the Charles Air Force Base on 2 separate occasions. The first was at the start of the show, where Kalusha and Rafe try to escape the base and are attacked by manglers. Kale gets injured during the escape and is taken by a passing Rita while Rafe stays behind to fend off the manglers, which he does by brilliantly baiting them to hold onto a giant container of gasoline before jumping off and shooting said container, causing a huge explosion that takes out the beasts. The second time is during the assault episode where Conrad released them to attack the Owashadi, alongside his underlings, but David fortunately manages to evade them and got out of the base just as it self-destructs with only one surviving mangler trying to attack him and Rafe, but failing in the end. Other than that, I don't remember any other significant manglers that opposed David. Though, a really frightening-looking mangler that resembles the xenomorph a little more clearly appears in the aforementioned false reality episode to attack him. There was also one mangler that attacked Kale and Rita in the pilot episode after Kale escapes the base. Seeing as how the feral manglers that Conrad released would hurt anyone, good or bad, you can classify them as neutral. Since most Dreamworks villains, like Death from Puss in Boots: The Last Wish, would fall into the neutral category but would still oppose the heroes in some way, I will also be talking about them, if for no other reason than in case my videos need to be lengthened. As we draw near to the end of the video, I would like to mention that there are a whole bunch of other established Tyrusian underlings who do work for the Dragit that at least have one or more speaking roles. These include Barco, the head of the moon base and the subordinate who refused to sacrifice his fellow soldiers on Conrad's orders and was shot for his disobedience. Another more prominent Dreamworks villain minion, Boss Wolf from Kung Fu Panda 2, would meet the same fate after he refused to kill his fellow wolves despite Lord Shen ordering him to do so. There also isn't really any established voice actor for them either. The actors who are credited to do the minor voice roles are Jeff Bennett, Tim Daly, Kevin Shawn, Carter Lee, Part Fraley, Scott Mosensen, Dee Wallace, Jess Harnell, and so much more others that I'll just leave a link in the description box below to give you guys the full scale. Other evil Tyrusian minions include the Galeem, I hope I pronounced that right, who dress as detectives and are sent to find David. Judging by their vague looks, these guys also have frightening designs, though I wouldn't say as frightening as Lomac. Apparently, they are given the alternate name, the Tall Men. They first appear in an early episode titled The Sun where, in a flashback, they attack Kale, Rita, Rafe and a young David just as Kale was calling a spaceship to take him to Tyrus to find the Ushadi, but the heroes manage to fight them off. Later in the episode in the present, after Rafe is taking David out for a drive, the Galeem appear blocking a path in order to take David away. Once David and Rafe try to lose them in the forest, the Galeem show that they are capable of flight and use their guns as flashlights almost as if they are police choppers. They later appear at David's home, interrogating his mother and manage to have the boy in their grasps. That is until David's powers begin to kick in and he disarms one of them of their guns, which Rita takes and buys her son time to escape, even killing one of them when he attempts to go after David. They later appear in the episode Capture where they appear at the mall to try and catch David once more after David's battle with Simon, but David manages to get away from them with help from Stark and Romar. They next appear sometime later in the back half of the show where they corner David in Washington, D.C., but David manages to once more defeat them, even using his powers on the face of one of them. And that is unfortunately the last time we see of these guys. To end things off here, since the Galeem only appear when David is on Maple Island, it's quite possible the Dragit stationed them there since that is where David grew up. Just spitballing here. Also, there's 2 novels based on the show, one that basically tells the story of the show and a prequel titled Invasion America, On the Run, both written by Christie Golden. And with that we come to an end on Invasion America and the second and last Dreamworks cartoon that they made during their starting period before moving on to movies. Join me next time as I talk about the villain of Dreamworks' very first and in my opinion, most underappreciated movie, General Mandible from Ants. Thank you for watching and I will see you all later.